The cold was a constant companion. It seeped through the threadbare wool of her tunic, a phantom that lived in her bones and never truly left. Alara knew the chill of the stone flags better than she knew a mother's touch. Her knees ached, a dull and familiar pain that radiated up into her hips as she scrubbed. Each pass of the stiff, bristled brush sent a jarring shock up her arm. Her hands were a mess of red, chapped skin and split knuckles that wept tiny beads of blood. They blended with the dirty water in the bucket, a small, unnoticed sacrifice to the endless, thankless task. This was her life, a cycle of cold, pain, and invisibility. She was an Omega, the lowest of the low in the Stonefang pack, a ghost who haunted the halls of the Great Lodge, scrubbing away the filth left by those who were born better. Her parents had been cast out years ago, their names spoken only as a curse, a warning against weakness. And she, their daughter, was left to bear the weight of their shame. A shadow fell over her. Alara didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of expensive winter rose perfume, cloying and sharp, always preceded Lyra. "Still scrubbing, filth?" Lyra's voice was like honey laced with poison. She stood with her hands on her hips, her fine leather boots tapping impatiently on the stones just inches from Alara's raw fingers. Alara kept her head down, her focus locked on the grime between the flagstones. Answering was a mistake. Silence was a mistake. Everything was a mistake. Survival was about choosing the mistake that hurt the least. A sharp kick sent the wooden bucket clattering across the floor. Icy, dirty water sloshed over Alara's legs, soaking her tunic and stealing what little warmth she possessed. The shock of it was a physical blow, a gasp of cold that made her teeth ache. "Clumsy thing," Lyra sneered, a cruel smirk twisting her perfect lips. "Look at the mess you've made. My father will hear of this. Perhaps a night in the ice cells will remind you of your place." Alara squeezed her eyes shut. The ice cells. A stone box cut into the mountain where the wind howled through a single slit and frost grew on the walls. People went in. They didn't always come out. She gritted her teeth, the muscles in her jaw screaming in protest. She would not cry. She would not beg. Crying gave them satisfaction. Begging gave them power. All she had left was the stubborn, silent refusal to break. Lyra huffed, bored by the lack of reaction. "Clean it up. And when you're done, the alpha requires Frostthorn for his evening tea. The bushes at the edge of the Whisperwood are thick with it this time of year." Alara's blood ran colder than the water on her skin. The Whisperwood, at dusk, with a storm rolling in from the north. The wind outside was already beginning to howl, a low and mournful sound that promised violence. Frostthorn was not rare. There were bushes right behind the kitchens. This was not an errand. It was a death sentence. "Get going," Lyra snapped, giving Alara's shoulder a shove with the toe of her boot. "Now!" Alara pushed herself to her feet, her body a symphony of aches. She didn't look at Lyra. She didn't look at the other pack members who watched from the warmth of the great hall fire, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. She just turned and walked toward the door, a worthless ghost on a fool's errand. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. It was a predator, armed with claws of ice and teeth of freezing air. It tore at her thin tunic, instantly finding every seam and tear. Snow, not yet a blizzard but promising one, swirled in sharp, angry flurries, stinging her cheeks. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the overwhelming cold. The path to the Whisperwood was barely visible, a faint track already being swallowed by the encroaching dusk and the thickening snow. Every step was a battle. Her feet, clad in worn-out slippers, were already numb. Why am I doing this? The question was a bitter whisper in her mind. She could turn back. She could hide. But where? Lyra would find her. The punishment for defiance would be worse than the storm. Maybe. The thought was a small, dark seed of rebellion. Maybe the storm was better, quicker, cleaner. An end to the endless scrubbing, the constant hunger, the soul-deep ache of being unwanted. She pushed the thought away. To survive was to win, even if survival was just another day of misery. It was the only victory she had ever known. The edge of the whisperwood was a wall of black trunks and groaning branches. The wind screamed through the pines, a sound that vibrated in her chest. She found a cluster of frost thorn, its wicked black thorns coated in a delicate layer of ice. Her numb fingers fumbled as she tried to snap a few twigs. A thorn, sharp as a needle, pierced the soft skin of her palm. She gasped, dropping the branches. A single drop of blood, startlingly red against the white snow, welled from the wound. And then the world dissolved into a fury of white. The blizzard struck without any further warning. The wind became a physical wall, the snow a blinding curtain. One moment she was standing, the next she was falling, tumbling down a steep, unseen embankment. She rolled, snow and loose rock scraping her, until she came to a jarring stop against something solid. Pain exploded in her head. For a moment she saw stars, not in the sky, but behind her eyes. Dazed and disoriented, she lay in a growing drift, the snow falling thick and fast, a soft, cold blanket intent on burying her. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fog in her brain. She had to move. She had to find shelter. She pushed herself up, her body screaming in protest. She was lost, utterly and completely lost. The world was nothing but a howling vortex of white and black. Stumbling blindly, she pushed forward, driven by a primal instinct she didn't know she possessed. Her hands were outstretched, searching for anything but empty, freezing air. Her fingers brushed against rock. A wall. She followed it, her breath coming in ragged, painful clouds. The rock face gave way to an opening. A cave. It was a dark, narrow slit in the mountainside, barely visible, but it promised a reprieve from the wind's relentless assault. With the last of her strength, she crawled inside, collapsing onto the blessedly still, dry floor. The sudden silence was deafening after the roar of the storm. She lay there, shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. It was dark, a profound blackness that her eyes couldn't pierce. But it was out of the wind. That was enough. A sound cut through the darkness. A low, pained groan. It wasn't the wind. It was animal, and it was close. Fear, stark and immediate, seized her. She froze, every muscle tensed. She wasn't alone. A predator had sought shelter here too. A bear? A mountain cat? She held her breath, listening. Another groan, this one deeper, followed by the wet, ragged sound of a difficult breath. There was a scent in the air, thick and metallic. Blood. And something else. Something wild and powerful, like ozone after a lightning strike. Slowly, cautiously, Alara pushed herself into a sitting position. Her eyes were beginning to adjust. A sliver of moonlight, a temporary break in the storm clouds, pierced the entrance of the cave, casting a pale, ghostly light into the space. And she saw him. It was a wolf. but it was a wolf beyond any she had ever seen. He was colossal, his form taking up a huge portion of the small cave. His fur was the color of midnight, thick and matted with snow and dark, sticky blood. A massive, gaping wound tore across his flank, a gruesome injury that pulsed with every shallow breath he took. He was dying. The thought was immediate, certain. Any other creature of the woods would have seen a threat. Any other member of her pack would have seen a monster. Alara saw only a creature in agony. The same agony she felt in her own heart, just a different shape. Hesitantly, she crawled closer. The wolf's head was down, its great body shuddering. He didn't seem to notice her. The scent of his blood was overpowering. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum of fear. What was she doing? This was madness. But she couldn't just leave him. Her life had been defined by cruelty, by people turning away from suffering. She couldn't be one of them. Not even for a beast that could kill her with a single snap of its jaws. She reached the wolf's side. Up close, he was even larger, a mountain of dark fur and muscle. She could feel the heat coming off his body, a feverish, desperate warmth. With a trembling hand, she tore a long strip from the hem of her already ruined tunic. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "I'm not going to hurt you." She leaned forward, her hand outstretched, the scrap of cloth held tight. She was going to clean the wound. It was a stupid, pointless gesture, but she had to do something. She had to try. The moment her fingers, clumsy and numb with cold, brushed against the edge of the wound, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A surge of raw power, hot as a forge and bright as the sun, erupted from the point of contact. It shot up her arm, a bolt of lightning that set every nerve on fire. She screamed, a sound torn from her throat, as an unbearable, searing pain burned itself into the flesh of her left wrist. The cave was filled with a blinding golden light that emanated from the wolf. His body convulsed, and the air crackled with energy. Through the glare, she saw a horrifying, impossible transformation. Bone cracked and reformed. Fur receded. The massive form of the wolf twisted and reshaped into that of a man. She scrambled backward, crab-walking away until her back hit the cold stone of the cave wall. The light faded, leaving dancing spots in her vision. Where the wolf had been, a man now knelt on the floor, breathing heavily. He was huge, broad-shouldered and powerful even in his weakened state. His skin was pale in the moonlight, corded with muscle and scarred with old battles. A fresh, terrible wound still marred his side, but it was no longer the gaping tear it had been on the wolf. His hair was long and black as a raven's wing, tangled and wild. Then he lifted his head, and his eyes found hers. They were not human eyes. They were the color of molten gold, glowing with an inner light, ancient and intelligent, and filled with a terrifying intensity. He looked at her, and she felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Not as an omega, not as filth, but as something else. His gaze dropped to her left wrist. She followed his look. There, on her skin, was a mark. It was intricate and silver, a swirling pattern of knots and spirals that seemed to glow with a soft light of its own. It hadn't been there a moment ago. It felt hot, a brand that marked her to the bone. The man pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. He was impossibly tall, his head nearly brushing the roof of the cave. He took a step toward her. She flinched, pressing herself harder against the rock, a pathetic whimper escaping her lips. He stopped. His golden eyes softened, the predatory intensity replaced by something she couldn't name. Awe, wonder, and a deep, aching possessiveness that resonated in the very air between them. His voice, when he spoke, was deep as thunder, and it vibrated through the stone at her back. "You're her." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, of a truth he had known for centuries. He took another slow step. "I've been waiting for you." Her mind screamed. What was happening? Who was this man? What was this mark? Her body, however, betrayed her. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but underneath it, something else was stirring, a strange, inexplicable pull toward him. The silver mark on her wrist pulsed with a gentle warmth, a silent song that only her blood could hear. He was close now, close enough for her to feel the heat of his body, to smell the scent of pine, winter storm, and his blood. He knelt before her, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a frightened fawn. He didn't try to touch her. "Mine," he breathed, the word a vow, a claim, a prayer answered after 1,000 lonely years. Alara just stared, trapped in the gravitational pull of his golden eyes. Fear and a terrifying, desperate hope warred within her. He was a monster. He was a man. He was her savior. He was her doom. She was falling, and she didn't know if he was the ground or the endless sky. His name was Kale. He was not just a wolf, but a wolf shifter. And not just any shifter. He was the Alpha King, the supreme leader of all the northern packs, a figure of myth and legend she'd heard whispered about in terrified awe. He had been wounded in a skirmish with a territorial beast while scouting the edges of his vast domain alone. He was still weak. The bond, the soul bond he called it, had healed the worst of the wound, but it had taken a toll on both of them. The searing pain in her wrist had faded to a constant warm thrum, a physical reminder of the impossible connection that now tied her to this ancient, powerful being. They were trapped in the cave by the raging blizzard. For 2 days they spoke little. He would watch her with those intense golden eyes, an expression of fierce tenderness on his harsh, beautiful face. He tore a strip from his own fine tunic to properly bind her hand where the thorn had pierced it. He insisted she take the warmest part of the cave, shielding her body with his own as she slept, a furnace of protective warmth. Alara was a wreck of confusion. Her mind, conditioned by years of abuse, screamed that this was a trick, a trap. Kindness was a weapon, and she was waiting for the blow to fall. But her body, her very soul, hummed with a sense of peace she had never known. The bond was a constant presence, a warm thread connecting her to him. When he was in pain, she felt a dull echo of it. When he looked at her with that soft possessiveness, a strange, fluttering warmth bloomed in her chest. On the 3rd day, the storm began to subside. Kale was stronger. He could stand without swaying, and the color was returning to his face. He planned to take her with him, back to his fortress at the heart of the mountains. He promised her safety, a home, a life she couldn't even begin to imagine. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar emotion, began to unfurl within her. Could this be real? Could her life truly change? Could she be more than the worthless Omega of Stonefang? That was when the man appeared at the mouth of the cave. He was from her pack. She recognized him as Borin, a hunter who was always in Lyra's shadow. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. The legendary Alpha King, looking worn but formidable, and her, the Omega girl, huddled near him. Then his gaze fell to her wrist. He saw the glowing silver mark. A flicker of understanding, then avarice, crossed his face. He didn't bow. He didn't run. He gave a short, almost mocking nod and then backed away, disappearing into the snow-laden trees. Kale let out a low growl. He knows. He knows what you are to me. What does it mean? Alara whispered, hugging her arms around herself. It means trouble, Kale said, his golden eyes hardening. He will not go to his alpha. He serves another, a shadow that has been grasping for my throne for a decade. Lord Valerius. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over her, extinguishing the fragile spark of hope. She was not a person to bore in. She was a key, a weapon to be used against the man who had just promised her the world. We have to leave, Kale said, his voice urgent. Now. He helped her to her feet, his large hand gentle on her arm. But it was too late. They emerged from the cave into the cold, bright light of the snow-covered forest, and they were surrounded. Figures in dark gray cloaks, their faces hidden in shadow, moved silently between the trees. They carried weapons of black iron and silver, the Ember Covenant, Valerius's personal guard. Kale pushed her behind him, his body shifting into a defensive stance. A low, menacing growl rumbled in his chest, a promise of violence. You will not touch her, he snarled. The leader of the group, a tall man with a face like a hawk, laughed. The great Alpha King, brought low by an Omega stray. Lord Valerius sends his regards. He has a use for your little pet. The fight was brutal and swift. Kale moved like a lightning storm, a blur of claws and fury. He was magnificent and terrifying, a king defending his territory. But he was still not at his full strength, and they were many. They didn't try to kill him. They worked to contain him, to separate him from her. While Kale was occupied with 3 of the Covenant, 2 more lunged for Alara. She cried out as rough hands seized her. Kale! She screamed, his name torn from her throat in pure terror. He roared, a sound of pure, helpless fury, and threw one of his attackers into a tree with enough force to shatter bone. But as he turned, another Covenant member slapped something cold and heavy onto Alara's wrists. Manacles, made of polished silver. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded from her wrist. The silver burned her skin, a searing, acid-like agony. But worse, far worse, was the other feeling. The bond, the warm, living thread that connected her to Kale, was suddenly choked, dampened, stretched thin until it felt like it would snap. A wave of nausea and a soul-deep ache washed over her, a spiritual amputation that was more painful than any physical wound. She could feel his panic, his rage, his agony, but it was distant, muffled, like a scream heard from underwater. She stumbled, her vision going gray at the edges. The Covenant members dragged her away, pulling her back into the trees. The last thing she saw was Kale, held back by sheer numbers, his golden eyes blazing with a grief and fury so profound it scarred her soul. He howled her name, a sound of such utter desolation that the entire forest seemed to tremble with his sorrow. Then the trees swallowed her whole, and she was plunged into darkness and pain. The journey was a blur of misery. The silver manacles were a constant source of torment, the cold burn never ending. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the void where the bond had been. There was a hollow space in her chest, a gaping wound that wept with a silent, unending scream. She felt alone, more alone than she had ever been in her life, because now she knew what it felt like not to be. She was taken to a fortress of black stone, a jagged spike thrusting into the sky from a windswept mountain peak. It was a place of shadows and cold, echoing with whispers and the clang of steel. She was thrown into a cell. It was small, damp, and freezing, no different from the ice cells at Stonefang, but infinitely worse because of the silence in her soul. Hours, or perhaps days, later, the door opened. A man stood there, silhouetted by the torchlight from the hall. He was handsome, in a sharp, predatory way, with dark eyes that held a chilling intelligence. He radiated an aura of power that was a cold, stagnant parody of Cale's vital warmth. "So," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, "this is the creature that has captured the heart of a king." He stepped into the cell, looking down at her with an expression of detached curiosity, as if she were an interesting insect. This was Lord Valerius. "A rather unimpressive specimen," he continued, circling her. "Filthy, malnourished, worthless. It is a testament to Cale's weakness that he would bind himself to the likes of you." Alara pressed herself against the wall, the silver chains clinking. She said nothing. Valerius smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "No matter. Your worth is not in what you are, but in what you can do for me. This bond," he gestured to her manacled wrists, "is Cale's greatest strength. It is also his greatest weakness, a vulnerability I intend to exploit." He knelt down, his face uncomfortably close. His eyes were like chips of obsidian. "I have studied the old magic. The lore of the soul bond is quite clear. It cannot be broken by force without destroying both parties. But it can be unraveled, severed, with the right ritual, a ritual that will not just break the bond, but turn its power inward on the one who remains. It will cripple Cale. It will shatter his spirit, break his power, and leave his throne ready for the taking." He paused, letting the horror of his words sink in. "Of course," he added conversationally, "the ritual requires a sacrifice. The vessel of the bond must be consumed by it. It will tear you apart, little Omega. Your soul will be the fuel for my ascension." Ice flooded Alara's veins. He was going to use her to destroy Cale, and then she would be annihilated in the process. Despair, absolute and suffocating, crushed her. She had been given a glimpse of heaven, only to be dragged into the deepest pit of hell. All her life, she had been told she was worthless. Now her only value was as a tool for destruction. Valerius stood up, satisfied by the terror in her eyes. "The ritual will take place on the next full moon, in 3 days' time. Try not to despair too much. You are serving a great purpose, after all." He laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and left her alone in the crushing darkness. She curled into a ball on the cold stone, the silver chains a constant, agonizing reminder of her fate. She wept. Not for herself, but for Cale. He had waited centuries for her, only for her to become the instrument of his downfall. It was a cruelty beyond measure. The weight of it was too much to bear. She wished for the storm to return and bury her. She wished she had never touched him, never known him, never felt the warmth of the bond. As she drifted in that black ocean of despair, something pierced through the gloom. A flicker, a whisper in the silent void of her soul. "Alara." She froze. It was his voice, faint, strained, but it was him. Hold on. The voice was a thread of golden light in the overwhelming darkness. The bond is not broken, only muffled. I feel you. I am coming. A single, ragged sob of relief escaped her. He was alive. He was fighting. The bond, though damaged, still held. It was a tiny pinprick of light in an infinite night, but it was enough. Cale, she thought, pouring all her desperation and fragile hope into the name. I'm here. I have you, the voice answered, a promise that echoed across the painful distance. Hold on. She clung to that promise like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. He was coming. She just had to hold on. The day of the full moon arrived, cold and clear. The hours bled away, each one a step closer to the end. Alara sat in her cell, her focus turned inward, clinging to the fragile thread of her connection with Cale. It was her only anchor in a sea of fear. The cell door scraped open, but it was not Valerius who entered. It was Lyra. Her face was flushed with triumph and malice. She was flanked by 2 burly women from the Ember Covenant. Lyra had always despised Alara, but seeing her here, chained and destined for death, brought a new, feverish cruelty to her eyes. She had clearly thrown her lot in with Valerius, eager for power in the new regime. Look at you, Lyra sneered, circling Alara like a vulture. The Alpha King's great love, a filthy rat in a cage. Did you really think someone like him would want someone like you? Alara stared at the floor, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. He will be free of you soon, Lyra said, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. But first, a small gift, a reminder of what you are and what you will always be. She nodded to the 2 women. Hold her. They grabbed Alara, hauling her roughly to her knees. One of them held her head, yanking it back by her tangled, dirty hair. Lyra produced a long, wicked-looking knife from her belt. And then, with a grin of pure, sadistic pleasure, she brought out a pair of iron shears. In the old packs, Lyra said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy, when an Omega shamed herself beyond all measure, they would mark her, so everyone would know her for the worthless thing she was. She grabbed a handful of Alara's hair and, with a rough, sawing motion, began to cut. Alara cried out as the shears tore at her scalp. Hunks of her dark, matted hair fell to the filthy floor. The women laughed. Lyra was not gentle. She was not neat. She worked with a frenzied, hateful energy. When the shears were done, she used the knife, scraping it across Alara's scalp to get the last of the stubble. It was an act of ultimate humiliation, of stripping away the last vestige of her identity. They were not just cutting her hair. They were trying to carve the word worthless into her very being. When they were finished, they threw her back against the wall. Her scalp was a mess of nicks and cuts, bleeding sluggishly in the cold air. She raised a trembling hand to her head. It was bare, smooth and terribly exposed. She felt naked, flayed. Lyra crouched in front of her, her pretty face twisted with contempt. Now you look the part. A shorn, broken thing. Even if he finds you, he'll be disgusted. No one wants something like this. She gestured to Alara's head, then stood and kicked the pile of hair on the floor. Take her to the ritual chamber. As they dragged her through the cold stone hallways, every shadow seemed to mock her. Every whisper was about the shorn Omega. It was her lowest point. They had taken everything from her, her freedom, her hope, and now her last shred of dignity. the fragile connection to Kale felt impossibly far away. Despair was a black tide, and it was finally pulling her under. The ritual chamber was a vast, circular cavern deep beneath the fortress. The air was frigid and smelled of ozone and old blood. In the center of the room stood a black stone altar, carved with dark, unsettling runes. Valerius was waiting, dressed in ceremonial robes. They chained her to the altar, her arms spread wide. The silver of the new chains burned against her skin, and the pain was a welcome distraction from the utter hopelessness that consumed her. Valerius began to chant in a guttural, ancient tongue. The runes on the altar began to glow with a sickly purple light. The pain started as a low hum in her soul, an intensification of the ache she'd felt since her capture. But as Valerius's chanting grew louder, the hum became a roar. The bond was being twisted, pulled, shredded. It felt like her very essence was being unraveled, thread by painful thread. She screamed, a raw, agonized sound that was swallowed by the cavern's vastness. And then, a sound from above. A boom that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It was followed by another and another. The sound of a fortress wall being smashed to rubble. Shouts and the clash of steel echoed down from the upper levels. Valerius faltered in his chant, his head snapping up. A look of fury crossed his face. He's here. The doors to the cavern burst open. But it wasn't Kale. It was one of Valerius's guards, his face pale with terror. "My lord, the Alpha King! His wolves are everywhere! He was cut off as a massive, dark gray wolf slammed into him, a whirlwind of teeth and claws. Behind it poured more wolves, Kale's elite guard, their eyes glowing with battle lust. The cavern erupted into chaos. The Ember Covenant fought back, but they were met with the unrestrained fury of shifters defending their king's mate. Valerius ignored the battle. His face was a mask of cold rage. "No, he will not stop me!" He turned back to Alara, his chanting becoming a frantic, desperate shout. The pain intensified tenfold. It was an inferno in her soul. She felt the bond fraying, snapping, and with it, a distant, agonized roar from Kale that she felt more than heard. Seeing his plan failing, seeing the battle turning against him, Valerius's strategy changed. If he couldn't have the power, he would have revenge. He abandoned the ritual and drew a blade made of pure, solidified shadow. "If I cannot break him," he snarled, advancing on the altar, "I will give him a wound that will never heal." He raised the shadow blade above her heart. This was it, the end. Through the haze of her pain, she saw flashes of the battle. She saw Kale, now in his human form, a whirlwind of death and righteous fury, cutting a path toward her. His eyes, blazing gold, were locked on hers. He was so close. But Valerius was closer. Something inside Alara snapped. The humiliation, the pain, the despair, the sight of Kale fighting so desperately for her, the thought of Valerius landing that final, spiteful blow. It all coalesced into a single, incandescent point of pure, unadulterated rage. She was not worthless. She was not a tool. She was not a broken thing to be discarded. A force, ancient and vast and utterly unknown to her, rose up from the deepest core of her being. It was not cold like the stone or hot like the fire of the bond. It was warm. It was brilliant. It was the light of the first dawn, the heat of a star, the unyielding power of life itself. A blinding wave of pure, golden white light exploded from her body. It was utterly silent, but devastatingly powerful. The light washed over the cavern. The dark runes on the altar sizzled and went dark. The silver chains holding her dissolved into dust. The Ember Covenant members closest to her screamed as the light touched them, their shadow magic turning to ash, their bodies incinerated where they stood. The blast threw Valerius backward, and he shrieked as the light of life seared his shadow-forged body, leaving smoking burns across his skin. The cavern fell silent, save for the panting of wolves and the groans of the wounded. The wave of light had ended the fight instantly. Alara stood, unsteady on the altar. She was no longer chained. The light still clung to her, a soft, radiant aura that made her skin glow. Her shorn head, which had been a mark of shame, now shone like a holy beacon in the gloom. Valerius staggered to his feet, his face a ruin of burns and disbelief. He stared at her, at the impossible power radiating from her. What are you?" he stammered. She looked at him, and her voice, when she spoke, was not the timid whisper of an Omega. It was calm, clear, and resonant with the power that now flowed through her veins. A queen's voice. "I am Alara." Kale stood frozen for a half-second, his golden eyes wide with shock and utter awe. He looked at her, this radiant, powerful being, his mate, and a look of fierce, profound pride washed over his face. Valerius, driven by madness and hatred, let out a final, desperate roar and charged at Kael. But the fight was already over. Kael met his charge, and with a single, decisive movement, the Alpha King ended the threat of the shadowy usurper forever. Silence descended upon the cavern. The battle was over. The enemy was defeated. The air, which had been thick with violence and dark magic, now felt clean, purified by the light that still emanated from Alara. Kael didn't even glance at Valerius's fallen form. His eyes were only for her. He moved across the cavern floor, his steps urgent but reverent. He walked through the lingering glow of her power, unafraid, until he stood before the altar where she stood. He reached up, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently, so gently, cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, and the simple touch was an anchor, grounding her as the overwhelming power within her began to recede, settling into a warm, manageable pool in her chest. His golden eyes searched hers, filled with a universe of emotions, relief, awe, pain, and a love so profound it stole her breath. His gaze drifted up to her head, to the raw, scraped skin and the uneven stubble left by Lyra's cruel shears. She flinched, a lifetime of shame asserting itself. She expected revulsion, pity, the confirmation of Lyra's final, cutting words. "No one wants something like this." But Kael did not look disgusted. His expression softened into a look of such terrible, fierce tenderness that it made her heart ache. A deep, guttural growl of fury rumbled in his chest, not for her, but for the ones who had done this to her. Without a word, he released her. He turned and picked up the fallen blade from a Covenant guard's hand. It was a simple, sharp knife of dark steel. His wolves watched, confused. Alara watched, her heart pounding. What was he doing? He met her eyes again, his gaze unwavering and full of purpose. And then, with swift, clean strokes, he began to shave his own head. The motion was fluid, practiced, the gesture of a warrior who knew his way around a blade. His long black hair, the hair of a king, fell to the stone floor in dark swaths, mingling with the dust and debris of the battle. He did not stop until his own head was as bare as hers. He dropped the knife, It clattered on the stone, the only sound in the cavern. He stood before her, his powerful form now stark and raw. His newly shorn head gleamed in the faint light. They were a matched pair. A king and his queen, stripped of ornament, reduced to their essential selves. He stepped close again, his voice thick with an emotion that cracked on the words. "If this is the mark of my queen," he said, his hand gesturing from her head to his, "then I will wear it as my crown. We are the same, you and I." Tears, hot and cleansing, streamed down Alara's face. They were not tears of sorrow or shame, but of a release so absolute it felt like she was being reborn. Every cruel word, every taunt, every ounce of worthlessness she had ever carried was shattered by this single, profound act of solidarity. He had not just accepted her shame, he had taken it as his own, transforming it into an honor. She reached up, her hands no longer hesitant or trembling. With a certainty that came from the very center of her soul, she placed her palm flat against the hard muscle of his chest, directly over his heart. The bond, now clear and strong and singing between them, pulsed beneath her touch. "Mine," she whispered, the word not a breathy echo of his own, but a declaration, a claim, an acceptance. She was not just his, he was hers. As she spoke the word, the silver mark on her wrist flared with a blinding silver-gold light. Cale gasped, his back arching, as a corresponding mark, an identical swirling pattern of knots and spirals, burned itself into the skin over his heart, a mirror image of her own. The bond was complete, a two-way street, a perfect, unbreakable circle. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his body trembling. "I have you," he murmured, his voice ragged. "I have you." "You have me," she confirmed, her arms wrapping around his massive frame, holding on as if she would never let go. She was home. This was home. Days later, they stood on the high balcony of the Sunstone Citadel, Cale's fortress carved from the heart of a mountain. Below them, a vast courtyard was filled with thousands of shifters from all the northern packs, their faces turned upward. Alara stood beside him, her head held high. Her hair, like his, was just beginning to grow back, a soft, dark fuzz that was sensitive to the crisp mountain air. She wore robes of deep blue and silver, but she felt no need for finery. Her power, now a steady, warm presence within her, was all the adornment she needed. Cale raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent. His voice, amplified by the mountain's acoustics, rang out over the assembly. "You know me as your king," he began, his voice clear and strong. "Today, I present you with your queen." He turned to her, taking her hand. He did not introduce her as a rescued Omega or a long-lost mate. "This is Alara," he declared, his voice ringing with pride. "The Sun Queen of the North. When darkness threatened to consume us, it was her light that saved us. When I was lost, it was she who found me." He looked down at her, his golden eyes soft with love, then back to the crowd. His gaze was fierce, daring anyone to challenge him. The sight of their king, his head shorn in the same manner as the unknown woman beside him, had already sent shockwaves through the kingdom. It was an act of devotion so radical, so absolute, that it had become legend before they had even arrived. They saw not a mark of shame, but a crown of loyalty. A single wolf in the crowd let out a howl of approval. It was picked up by another, then another, until the entire courtyard was a deafening chorus of joyous, triumphant howls that echoed off the peaks. They were not just accepting her, they were celebrating her. Kyle squeezed her hand. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the kingdom that was now hers, at the man beside her who was her other half. The cold was gone from her bones, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. The ache of loneliness was gone, filled by a love that was as vast and solid as the mountains around them. She was not invisible. She was not worthless. She was Alara. She was a queen, and she was finally, truly home.